Well, good morning again, guys. I wanted to do a third follow-up video with the 500e, also on a cold day, but now that I've got the TomTom, which is probably one of the best accessories I've ever seen, and I'm kind of bummed that I lived so long without it, because it gives you not only how much power your climate control is using real time, but it also tells you how much your headlights and heated seats are using, and things like that, in the other systems, in addition to the motor power, which we can get in the gauge cluster. So right now it's 4 below, and I actually just preheated the car, plugged into my garage for about 15 minutes, and you can see that my 100% has turned into 91. So although it was able to draw power, pardon me, from my garage, it was drawing in excess of 6.7 kilowatts. So it was actually drawing closer to 8 or 9, all things considered. But the winter prior, sorry, I zoomed the wrong way. I just assumed every time I turned on the heat or the climate control in the 500, your range instantly went down about 8 miles. I'm like, oh, well, it doesn't matter how hot you keep it then. It's gonna use the same amount of power either way. But I just turned it down from 72 to 68. And we will see the climate power continue to decrease. So even if you have the climate set at about 60 degrees, when you get in the car, it will max out at about 8 kilowatts just to start heating the cabin. But once you get to the point where the cabin's almost up to that temperature, it'll start backing off the current that it's consuming. And I've found a lot of the time, just to maintain something like 65 degrees on a cold day, you'll end up at about 1.5 or 2 kilowatts, which is really pretty insignificant. If you think about it, that's really only about the power that your regular emergency charger is able to put out, or an average space heater. So in theory, if you did nothing but have the heat on maintenance in this car, you could run it for most of a day. So here I was avoiding using the heat as much as possible last winter, assuming that even if I had it at 60 degrees, it would be using 8 kilowatts, which is just not true, because in the grand scheme of things, especially if you preheat the car to a reasonable temperature and allow the battery to catch up, you're using very, very minimal power. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, maintenance heat takes a lot less power than, taking the edge off the heat in the cabin. So that's the main thing I've learned from the climate control here. And basically just completely ignore the guessometer, the mileage range thing, because it's actually more accurate a number when you're running the climate control than it is when you're not running it. And if you're running air conditioning, it pretty much never takes more than 1 kilowatt. And if you are just using it, again, to take the edge off, say you're keeping it at 74 on an 85 degree day, you're only going to be using like 200 watts of power. So never worry about the air conditioning. It's basically no power at all. And if you're just keeping your cabin from freezing you, so right now let me drop it to 60. And you can see that that dropped to 0. If I bring it back to 62, let's try 64. That wasn't my goal. 65? Anyway, sorry, that's kind of backfiring on me, but, oh, there it goes. So it is using just a teeny tiny bit of power. So it's using about 200 watts right now, and it's slowly coming back up to about 500. But anyway, I recommend, if you're trying to maximize winter range, don't necessarily max out the heat and then shut it off to just try to save power. I would recommend preheating your car if you can. Otherwise, just leave it at 60, and then the car it won't use very much power to keep the cabin at keeping you from dying temperature, basically. So that's the biggest thing I've learned with having the TomTom. It's a little bit in the way as far as your view is concerned, but I'm so used to it now, it really doesn't matter. My biggest gripe is I leave for work in the morning before the sun goes up, and that thing has the brightness of 1,000 suns. Before it boots up and dims a little bit, it does have 2 brightness stages, and it does eventually change. But yeah, that's a great piece of hardware. If you buy one of these things used like I did and it didn't come with the factory TomTom, I highly recommend paying the $100 for the TomTom and Cradle, because it really just gives you a lot more data, and it helps you understand what's going on with your car a lot better. So that's pretty much it. I have started using charge timers just to try to keep the battery warm just before I start my commute in the morning. Prior to that, I had it kick on at 9 p.m., which is when my off-peak power kicks in, and it would finish around midnight. And then I would have plenty of time to basically freeze the batteries again before I get to my car at 6 in the morning. So what I've done now is I turn on the charger at 3 a.m., and then when I get out to the car at 6, the battery is still warm from charging, so is the inverter. So it's a little bit more efficient that way to deliver power, and the car is much, much faster, because cold batteries, the car knows how cold the cells are, and it deliberately limits how much power can be taken out of them to prohibit damage. Actually, you know what I'm trying to say. It reduces the amount of current that can flow out of them so you don't damage the batteries, and it will retain more power for longer. But I've actually, thanks to another YouTuber, been able to get into the programming on this car, and I've figured out that it's only 76% of its original capacity at 70,000 miles here, which you can see I just rolled over on this drive. So I mean, all things considered, I still get about 40 to 45 miles of total range on a really cold day like this, or I guess it's above zero now. But I get about 65 miles of range on a summer's day with the air conditioning, and closer to 70 if I'm being economical and I'm not using climate at all, and I've got a little bit more of a city mix and I'm driving at more reasonable temperatures. So I feel like if I had another 25% of a battery charge, I would get a legitimate 100 miles out of this car, which would be much, much more useful. But again, I've got probably one of the most degraded 500E batteries, if not the most degraded I've ever seen, and it's also one of the higher mileage cars. So I'm actually trying to beat this thing as much as I can to see if I can get it to fail. Fiat Chrysler does not have the same battery warranty. They have the same terms, so it's 8 years or 100,000 miles. However, they don't have a capacity listed for replacement like most of the other manufacturers do. A lot of them are 70% of original capacity. Some of them are lower, some of them are 60, but largely it's 70%. So, considering these batteries are the same batteries that are in the BMW i3, and the BMW i3 is warranted to a 70% capacity, I think I could potentially make the argument to Fiat Chrysler that once my car hits 69% of original capacity, that they should consider, not necessarily buying the car back from me because I love it, but consider replacing my pack and then autopsying the old one, basically, just to see what happened. Because data like this is really, really valuable to manufacturers, not necessarily the auto manufacturers as much as Samsung in this case, the company that made the batteries for the car. So that's something I might pursue. At this rate, I am losing 1 or 2 kilowatt hours per year. But I mean, there are things you can do to prolong your battery's life, and that is basically avoiding as much as possible discharging it below 20% or charging it or leaving it charged, above 80%. Avoid high output and input currents, which I totally don't do. I pretty much run it maxed out the whole time. So, I drive with this thing completely pinned sometimes, and I do a lot of very, very high current regen, especially at low battery states. I drive it all the way down to 0%, so I do a lot of deep cycling, which is terrible for lithium batteries. I operate the vehicle in extreme temperatures, both cold and hot, which is really bad for the batteries. This thing every year sees negative 20, 30, 40 degrees, and well over 100 degrees. So, yeah, you can see right now, maximum output current is only about 70 kilowatts in this thing when it's this cold out, so she didn't like the cold very much, but I still do absolutely love this car. I've been looking at upgrading to a long-range EV, but the price point per kilowatt hour is just not there. this thing, I mean, a healthy one's got realistically 21 kilowatt hours usable and an 85-ish mile range. So you really do have to spend quadruple to really get enough of a range bump where it makes any difference at all. So I don't know, I'm gonna stick with this car for a while longer. Hopefully I can make something fail just to kind of see what happens. I'm noticing that my differential is starting to groan quite a bit, so maybe that'll fail. I'm not really sure what to expect, but yeah, certainly stay tuned. I don't think I'll do a fourth update unless I have something significantly new or different to tell you guys about the car, but the TomTom is an interesting development, and especially realizing that you can pretty much run the climate control if you do it smartly, and you won't really affect your range that much, because if you leave it maxed out, you will probably cut your range basically in half, depending on what kind of mix you're doing. For sure, it'll take 40% right off the top, but usually more if you're doing a heavier city mix, just because number of minutes per number of miles basically is how the heat works. But yeah, great car. I'm still daily driving it, still putting a ton of miles on it, and it's treating me really, really well. So yeah, thanks as always for watching, and hopefully this wasn't too boring, but if it was, sorry. just throwing some information out there. So thanks guys, I'll catch you next time.